Hello and welcome to another episode of Research Radio, a podcast of the Economic and Political Weekly. I'm Johan, and today we have with us Professor Inderjeet Parmar, who teaches international politics at City, University of London. Today we will be discussing his paper titled Polycrisis or Organic Crisis: The Crisis of the United States and the US-led World Order. His research interests are rooted in the rise of American power and particularly the role of the American foreign policy establishment over the past century. Professor Parmar's most recent book is titled The Foundations of the American Century. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Parmar.
You're very welcome, and I'm very glad to be here.
Professor Parmar, your paper focuses on the crisis of world order and world affairs that seems to be upon us, and you argue that the situation is so complex that it's impossible for any individual to see the bigger picture. So instead, you focus on the USA because you see it as playing a pivotal role in world affairs. Given the complexity of geopolitics today, why do you feel that it is important to look at the US, its internal politics, as well as its international relations to understand what is going on in the world?
Yeah, thank you. I think the main reason for me focusing on the United States is that that is my area of expertise over the last several decades, and it's the state, society, economy, and world power that I know best. And the advantage, I suppose, that I've been able to manufacture from that is that the United States is also central to the world system, that it has been the architect or one of the architects of the world system, what they now call the liberal international order, since the 1940s. And so all the kind of Bretton Woods institutions that we know about, were the US was central to those. And the consequence of that has been that that system has kind of extended itself to larger other parts of the world outside of North America and Western Europe since the 1960s and 70s in particular, and incorporated more and more what used to be called third world economies states and are now called global south states, although they're not all equal. So in that sense, the kind of international or global processes rooted in the United States sense of what the world system ought to be and what is most congenial to it has extended itself and begun to and impacted very, very greatly major other powers, which have now emerged as more self-confident and assertive and wanting a closer relationship with the core powers of the world system. So even with a power like China, for example, the United States and many other Western countries played a key role in China's integration into the world system, which enabled it to become what it is today. That's not the only thing that was going on, because internally, Chinese elites, the Communist Party leadership had decided where China was kind of going, and I think they had maintained a lot of control. But they were given a great deal of support, and that was to a great advantage of the United States and the West, because prior to that, China was a thorn in the side of the West. It was supporting national liberation movements. It had an alternative ideology, idea of what the basis of economy ought to be, and so on. And that had great advantages. So, in that sense, then, the United States is very, very important. It's very pivotal. But as I say, every state, society, economy has its own history, its own culture, its own active agents and structures and institutions. And to become an expert on what is going on in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and 100 other countries that it would take too long to mention, it is, I mean, it's certainly beyond my personal capacity. And that's where, if you like, focusing in then on areas that I do know more about, but trying to extend my knowledge by, if you like, teaming up with scholars from India and China, which I have, and Brazil and other countries. I'm in effect trying to fill in the big gaps in my own empirical knowledge, and sort of and thinking about what does it mean to be India in the world system today from within the Indian establishment's mindsets, as well as the broader aspirations of Indian people, north, south, east, west, rich, poor, and so on. So yeah, so it's basically a kind of device to manage and maximize the advantages I can bring, but at the same time, I've learned a lot from scholars and colleagues around the world, and I really value that. And having those global networks, I think, is probably the only way for us nowadays, given the amount of information available from every source, to try to make sense of what is real, what is valuable, what is valid, and what is just speculative or conspiratorial or other forms of thinking which social media enables today.
Yeah. You make an interesting point about the rise of the global south, specifically that this rise has happened within this existing world order that you just mentioned and not as an alternative to it. Could you elaborate on this a bit more? Because I was thinking that if this is the case, how will the new hegemony that Gramsci talks about, that you also mentioned in your paper, the one that has more inclusive and elements of the
Mm,
population and of the world,
mm,
society and state and global zone within it, how
yeah.
does that new hegemony come about?
Well, I mean, I suppose there are sort of 2 points I would make. One is that there is a great deal of rhetoric when there was the G77, the Third World, the new demands in the 70s for a new international economic order. And there are similar things going on at a different level with the BRICS and the extension of the BRICS, which is proceeding. So that you do have, if you like, the rise of elites within a wider range of societies across the global south, which are demanding, which have been enabled to rise to where they are via neoliberalism and the liberal order, increasingly including them into itself. However, their rhetoric is mobilizing masses of people inside their states and societies who have demands which, if you like, challenge that sort of fundamental order of particularly kind of neoliberal globalization, because while a fairly large percentage, maybe 30% or more in some societies, has benefited from neoliberalism and globalization, there's a very large, much larger parts of the population who've been displaced, they have been impoverished, they've become landless and dispossessed. Climate change has forced them to move from one place to another. That is, their life chances and the levels of inequality uh, and deprivation that they experience is also making big demands for change. And to some extent, the decolonial, anti colonial, post colonial forms of rhetoric in many of these societies in the global south are ways of mobilizing those national masses to suggest that reform at the international system level will benefit them too. And it may. However, it'll benefit more elites in the global south, speaking for ordinary Indians or ordinary people and so on, is very much a device to mobilize them as a way, as a bargaining counter to get a closer position to the big table of world power. And just as in the 1970s with the new international economic order, which was a demand for greater say for elites, which they succeeded in, it didn't necessarily lead to very, very widespread benefits for vast proportions of the population. So I think in that regard, the real counter hegemony is from those millions and millions of people who are at the negative end of neoliberalism. And to manage that, obviously there are all sorts of state strategies which have been followed: divide and rule, ethnopolitics, communal politics, caste politics, as well as kind of racist politics in many countries around the world as well. So, so I would say there are two things going on. One is elites wanting better integration and more say and power in world affairs, and using the masses as a kind of, to say we're all behind this in a kind of nationalistic discourse when they know full well that the benefits of this are largely going to accrue to big corporate interests, um, which want their state to be able to win for them far greater access to far more resources and markets and investments and so on.
You, in your paper, you identify three concepts, namely the organic crisis, singularity, and polycrisis, to make sense of the times that we're in. Could you explain each of them briefly, and what is the difference between each of them?
I think singularity was interesting to me purely on the basis of the United States. So the idea of singularity comes from mathematics, and it was used in a book by James Bennett on the Anglosphere. And where in that book he argues that the Anglosphere, the English speaking countries in the world, are kind of the future of the world. And that's because they have so many advantages in so many areas simultaneously. But at a certain point in mathematical thinking, when a large number of factors coincide and intersect and overlap, and so what you've had is a sort of gentle, linear historical development. But at a certain point, all these different forces, technology, society, thinking, economy, they come together and they explode. They explode in such a positive manner that that society becomes the superior society. So from being a linear development, it becomes like a vertical superiority. What I did was I looked at the United States in relation to that, and I thought, well, 2016 sounded to me like a sort of singularity, but in reverse. That's when the United States, from its kind of sort of linear development with two main political parties which shared a broad range of ideas and about the world and about the society and where it was going, to one which fell off a cliff with the election of Donald Trump, and whose main challenger, at least in the primaries, was Bernie Sanders, who was kind of marginalized out by various machinations in the Democratic Party, led by Hillary Clinton. So that, in effect, a large number of negative factors coincided and overlapped and intersected, and has led to a cliff for the United States, a cliff where civil war is being openly talked about by people who are not conspiracy theorists. And just yesterday, when Biden made a speech, he talked about the threat to democracy from Donald Trump and from the Republican Party, which he says no longer believes in the rules of democracy when you happen to lose an election. So if you like singularity, I guess if I thought about it a little bit more, perhaps you could apply that negative singularity to other Western societies and maybe other societies as well, where in order to manage so many negative factors coming together, the sort of politics is toxic politics. It's the politics of turning people against one another as a result of identities and identification with being, black or Asian or Muslim or Hindu or European or white or male or some other sexuality, gender, whatever. And you try to use that because you actually haven't got a solution to the problem. The big problem is that more people want a lot more in their lives and for themselves and their children than elites are willing to share. And that's the problem. And singularity is kind of one way of thinking about that. Polycrisis is the kind of orthodox liberal Bretton Woods ideology now. It says, yes, multiple crises, multiple systems intersecting, overlapping, climate crisis, pandemic, Russian invasion, economic and financial precarity, etc., rise of the far right, authoritarianism, rejection of legitimacy of trust in established politics, and so on. And it says we have a problem. The interesting thing about polycrisis, it's a liberal view which promotes the idea of crisis, but it has a built-in a theory of crisis management, which derives also from liberalism itself. And so,
I
if you look
see.
at the work of somebody like the Princeton scholar John Eikenberry, who's kind of the leading voice in liberal internationalist thinking, his argument is that liberalism is, in effect, the universally most progressive, most advanced, and only system. So he doesn't call it the end of history, but he speaks as if there is no other alternative. And his argument is that since the Enlightenment and the rise of liberalism, liberalism has been more inclusive than any other system. However, at any historical period, its level of inclusivity is sort of frozen in time according to the voices which are heard and which are significant. Of course, 20, 30, 40 years later, there are those who are outside or marginal, or those who were central have become weaker, and therefore liberalism goes into a crisis. But it's a self correcting crisis managing machine.
I see.
It will then extend its boundaries, include more voices who happen to be the loudest at that particular time, most significant. But 20, 30 years later, it will go into crisis. So, crisis is built into liberalism, but so is self correction built into liberalism. So, polycrisis then says, okay, maybe in 1945 and 1989 and so on, we were a bit exclusive, restrictive to the global south and others. We can open our doors. China, India, Brazil, others, and so on. We would probably do need to put them on the UN Security Council or in the IMF more votes or World Bank or WTO or whatever it might be. That is to say, and the elites of the global south buy into the poly crisis because they're going to benefit from it. They're going to make a new deal which enables them to sit closer to the top of that table than they used to be. And as bargaining chips, they are now able, because of the world structure and distribution of power, they've got more regional partners and global partners with China and Russia, for example, and Brazil and others. They can now, if you like, do what India says it's doing, kind of multi alignment. Just like the US has so many special relationships, so the Saudis are saying we have many special friends too. Let's dance. And I think that is what is happening. So polycrisis is that kind of liberal view. Organic crisis is actually the kind of Gramscian view, which is far more radical in its idea about the source of the crisis, as well as where the solution to the crisis may lie. And that is to say that while they would agree that we're in this organic crisis, which is a comprehensive crisis, it's a crisis of every part of that system: political, ideological, moral, deep down to the personal, and so on. And that the coalition or the hegemonic or historic bloc, which is at the center of that hegemony, no longer commands respect, support for its underlying values and strategies and systems from the mass of ordinary people who are now shifting their support either totally away from the established leaders and parties, or are just leaving and ignoring politics altogether, and maybe even developing alternative strategies. And that's where I think the Gramscian view says that politics is more than just institutions. It's more than just the established political parties. There are actually people with aspirations outside of those who are not included in those. And they're the source, if you like, which any kind of what Ramsey would say is a communist party or a party, a vanguard party, would need to weld together in a kind of cross class, cross racial coalition in order to sort of, if you like, live the new way of life, in order to kind of engender that much more radical counter hegemonic change, which is a revolutionary change. Because, as Gramsci defined, the state is coercive and persuasive, but it is always coercive. And it has vast resources on its side. And even in Italy in the 1920s, that knowledge that the state is so well armed and so on, and it has its fascist phalanges and militias and so on, was not heeded by socialists and others. And we had the Mussolini governments and Gramsci put in jail and so on. So they're the kind of three differences. And I would say Singularity is a sort of conservative variant of liberalism. because at the base of liberalism also is a racialized worldview about the Anglo-Saxon ism. So, what was a biologically racist kind of project from the mid 19th century into the 20th century kind of went into a secular form, a cultural form of the West and aid to the rest, which had a inferior culture and so on. It sort of it took away the racialized language, but that racialized language is back. Clash of civilizations, a white supremacist president from 2016 to 2020, who is going to be the candidate for the Republican Party and could win. Last time, about 200,000 votes in 3 states had gone the other way, he would be in the White House now.
Yeah.
So that's the way on.
I would like to ask a methodological question, about analyzing the world that is getting increasingly more complex. While this is happening, we also see that our capacity to understand complex phenomenon has also increased through technology, and it's also likely to increase further. Do you think that using technological tools might help make sense of complex geopolitics? Or do you think that the prevailing hegemony penetrates any technologies that we might try to use to make sense of it?
I think both of those things are happening simultaneously. Technology is developed by big corporations in alliance with governments and other elites and so on. And of course, how it is used is obviously for profit maximization, but also means of political and ideological influence and control. So social media is a great democratizing kind of force. Now anyone with a phone or a laptop has access, in theory, to the world as a whole. But we know that I have my little Twitter account and I may tweet, but the BBC, on the other hand, or Elon Musk he can employ thousands of people to tweet on his behalf, which is to say, yes, it's democratized, and that has been a challenge, and that has shaken up things in the way in which I was talking about. But at the same time, it remains more fundamentally in the hands of those who created it, either for profit or for control or both. But yes, I think technology, just like it can be a tool of social control, for those who are able to use it, and that can be somebody with a laptop with a very well developed, qualifications about how to use technology. There are people who hack into the Pentagon computer system, and people who hacked into the State Department's own servers and leaked millions and millions of documents, and they're doing that all the time. So I think both are going on at the same time, and those who are able to analyze large data, those who are marketing their wares through corporate power and so on, they're able to know who I am and what I might think I need and so on, and nudge me in certain directions. Those who use those sort of data in politics can try to nudge people in various directions, but there are those who can also try to nudge people in other directions as well. So, in effect, technology then occurs, and technological development occurs in the matrix of power relations and the distribution of resources. But I think the technologies we have today are more enabling for a wider range of people, just because the profit maximization motive has put a mobile phone into the hands of people who
Everyone.
don't necessarily have to have a very large income. And so inadvertently, you also have given them a tool. And that's why all kinds of controls on what you can say and can't say, and so on and so forth, restrictions, particularly on very radical organizations, have to be inaugurated because people want to hear alternative ideas at this time.
You pointed out in your paper that there is this tension nowadays where geopolitics seems to be pulling countries apart, while globalization has already bound them together economically. So, while there is talk of deglobalization and the rise of nationalism, there is also a failure of economic sanctions approach to geopolitics. And as I was reading your paper, I was also wondering if what we are witnessing is actually a reconfiguring of the idea of the modern nation state. Would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, that's a really big, complicated question and subject, actually, and but very thought provoking. And I guess really the kind of the so-called modern nation state as a sort of black box in a system of nation states was probably never quite as true as some theorizing would suggest. That the making of the modern state was an international sort of factor. So when you look at the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or the French Revolution, there are many international factors which are involved in the making of those kind of states as well. So that is to say, I guess power is always networked. The state isn't separate within the society, but networked with key forces within it, and it's networked with global or international or regional forces outside it. So the Holy Roman Empire and the role of the Vatican and the Pope and so on. And so in that regard, and then of course you got your commercial, financial, economic flows with some protectionism, customs unions, and so on. So I think I would suggest that probably it was never quite true that the state was like a billiard ball in kind of banging against another as opposed to intersecting like Venn diagrams and so on. So I suspect what's happened in the last maybe since the 1970s in a very big way, but even before that with empires which broke down the kind of barriers between what were former nation states and so on, that you have so many multiple sinews and connections of all kinds that now it's kind of reached a very different kind of level, maybe a more intense and more extensive and more extensive in the world, such that it's difficult to think of any states which are outside of that matrix of relationships. And the consequence of that is that it's had a big effect on the domestic configurations of power inside those states and societies. And in order to become kind of far more competitive within it, states have adopted policies which have weakened collective worker power and other social kinds of programs and so on, and converted themselves into institutions to promote their positions in the global flow of capital. And so, therefore, that has changed, if you like, the state and what it does, but the state remains a coercive institution. It remains the governing institution, even if it's enabled corporate power to become more powerful than it used to be. And you can see now with the protectionist, nationalistic kind of strategies that so many state countries are following, that they are able to take on certain corporate interests and try to marginalize and sideline or push them in certain directions. So the United States is trying to push a large number of American microchip makers and others away from China and elsewhere. And those are very, very powerful institutions. But the geopolitical sort of competition to remain the hegemon is intensifying. And so it sort of says that the state actually, it never really went away. It became more enabling of a certain way of being, but now the coercive elements are required. They are converting those very corporations into, they're weaponizing them themselves. So the state, if you like, has got these parastate relationships. And so there's dense networks and so on. I think the state just never disappears. It's always there because, in a way, those people, Theda Skocpol in her book States and Social Revolution in 1979, she said, people in the state sit on the wall between their domestic and the global, and they look in both directions at the same time because they've got to manage both together. And that's what gives them their unique position. That's what enables them to alienate even very powerful forces at certain times, because state survival is their job. That's what they're there for.
One thing that you do mention in your paper, but you don't get into in detail, is the climate crisis or the environmental crisis. And I
Yeah.
wanted to mention this specifically because while climate change does impact geopolitics, it also transcends it in a way. So I wanted to ask, how do you see
Mm.
this as featuring in the organic crisis, singularity, and polycrisis analysis?
Wow, that's huge. Um, I'm not an expert on the climate crisis and environmental crisis and issues, but you're right, it does transcend geopolitics because it's about survival of the planet. And even if it's not at that kind of existential level, it is about the disruption of the population flows and therefore societies, economies, polities, borders within the state and security. That is to say, that even if you can manage the climate crisis at a certain level, so it doesn't become a total and utter catastrophe of wiping out life, the fact is the climate crisis has many other effects, which has already very, very visible. So those people at the southern border of the United States, in part, are also there because of the climate crisis, many other things, but also the climate crisis. Tens of millions of people are on the move around the planet because of the climate crisis. So that it becomes, if you like, something which transcends the state and the nation, and it becomes a really big issue which needs management by a broader range of power. So in that regard, it kind of is something which adds to the globalized character, the networked character of global power today, and it says governments, even those which are opposed to each other in certain areas, need to work together in other areas and try to manage this crisis, but always with a view. So, from the poly crisis perspective, this will be with a view to green energy, green credentials, green businesses. That is, empowering big corporate interests to shift over through massive subsidies from towards so-called cleaner, greener energy sources and so on and so forth. So that what in effect you're doing is you're giving a capitalistic incentive to shift from one way of doing things to another way, which in the longer run it enables to manage certain levels of climate change, perhaps to just to keep it at a certain level, but it empowers other corporate or maybe new corporate forces. So the political economy doesn't really change very much. People's attitude towards consumption doesn't change very much. The kind of idea that the consumer is sovereign and you can have anything you want if you work hard enough and so on and so forth, that doesn't go away. The ideology of consumerism, on which, and then borrowing money to continue to consume, which then goes into the pockets of banks and companies because you buy on debt and build up that huge debt, that doesn't change. So in effect, it's not it's a liberal management. Again, it suggests that from within liberalism and liberal political economy, you can actually solve the crisis. It may not solve the crisis. It may just keep it at a manageable level at certain points. Organic crisis would say, well, look, that's all you're effectively doing. You're managing your hegemony so as not to kind of weaken you too much or to, in fact, incorporate new factors which may strengthen you for the next 20, 30 years, allow you to manage. And thereby, if you integrate India and China and Brazil into this coalition to management climate change and manage climate change and so on, you can reduce those flows of people. They will get employment within those, hopefully in those countries and so on, maybe precarious, but everybody a little bit better off. Whereas the organic crisis would say, actually, you need to go to the root of the issue. The root of the issue is not just natural events which are going on, natural processes, but these are human-made processes which enrich some and immiserate others, and that in effect you're just postponing us for another maybe 15, 20 years um, from an even greater kind of catastrophe that may come along.
I like that you tried to end your paper on a hopeful note, especially since the idea that we are currently living in an age of disorder and crisis can be very stressful. But to what extent is this idea itself the result of the way in which media and the social media function? The sensationalizing tendencies, the polarizing echo chambers, the self-fulfilling prophecy of crises that they create also serve certain agenda.
Yeah.
What I mean to say is that alongside thinking about crises, do you think it's fair to ask whom does it benefit for us to think that we live in an age of disorder and crisis? Because if it benefits someone, right, to be hopeful, starts to become a revolutionary act.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right that things like order, disorder, crisis, often they are always weaponized. The discourse is a sometimes a crisis is also an opportunity. So if you talk up something as a certain kind of crisis, it can be an opportunity to inaugurate very radical change, so that in effect, it's a kind of a shock doctrine. You play up a Naomi Klein and so on. Condoleezza Rice on September the 12th, 2001. How do we use this crisis to get what we want? And the Iraq War was one of the results, and the War on Terror, of course, was the other. So, yes, crises, it's not that there isn't a problem, but whether it's a crisis of a particular form, as in you need to declare war, that's a political act. So crises and disorders always are part of a discourse which has a certain kind of way of thinking about it and certain kind of goal which they're trying to promote. So polycrisis, I mean, the initial thing among liberals was that there is no crisis. And then when people say, actually, look, even your Harvard graduate with a degree from one of the world's best universities is no longer able to command a job outside of the precarious system. There's something deeply wrong here, that you've saddled them with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, and they don't have a prospect of a really secure job in the long run and live the American dream. And if we extrapolate that to broader, that's what we're being sold. You behave like this, do X, Y, Z, and so on. So when those people start rising up and saying, "Well, we can't live the life," etc., then other governments, societies, countries, and so on join that, then I think it does become. But they interpret crisis in a different way, or the self-correction, resilience, we can overcome, renew, and so on. So crisis is always used. It's never neutral. It's never neutral. I guess if you got a world war, I think everybody would then agree there is a crisis. Or you have 1929, 1930, and 2008. I don't think you can say it's business as usual, but not everybody is responsible and not everyone suffers in the same kinds of ways. So 2008 was called the global financial crisis, but large parts of Asia did not experience that kind of crisis in that way at all. They'd had a 1997 Asian financial crisis and they were a bit more robust uh, as a result of that. So I think sometimes what happens is, of course, those with the greatest level of discursive power, access to media, and what are called world leaders, and the world believes, and they make the speech in the United Nations, which the world hears, they construct what the world is, and usually it's a very small minority of the world's population. And they decide what is not a crisis, what is a problem, what is a crisis. So crisis is always inside that kind of set of debates. But what I was trying to say was, I suppose, is that what Gramsci put forward the idea, and he was probably one of the most pessimistic analysts of his age and other ages as well. And his idea was that you shouldn't be wearing rose-colored spectacles when you look at the world and look at the issues and problems within it. You've got to wage political warfare on the terrain of politics as it is, with people, with how they think as they do today, but with a view to fighting and arguing and debating and mobilizing on that terrain to move people from where they are somewhere else, which is much better. And that's a kind of ideological, political struggle. And so his argument was, yes, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, because despite overwhelming force and power and influence in few hands, radical revolutionary change does occur. Large numbers of people do protest. India had the biggest general strike in world history not too long ago. The farmers from Punjab and northern India and so on gathered in Delhi and had a big influence. Indian people throughout the British rule and so on. And you have so many examples historically where the so called, as they used to say in the French Revolution, the little people, large numbers of little people come together, and then the big people, who are few, can't govern in the old way. So I guess that's what I was trying to get to was, and I was speaking at that lecture that I gave to an audience of undergraduates and young postgraduate students, and I didn't want to finish the thing by saying that we are powerless, but actually the latent power in those so-called little people like me and them and so on is very, very great. And that's why the management and control of populations is the principal point of politics. And those divide and rule strategies, which are incredibly costly, resource intensive, and they occupy every area of life, from the school curriculum to the mass media to the parliament, and so on and so forth. Because managing large numbers of people is incredibly difficult, and keeping them passive or divided is a kind of strategy. But I guess that's what I was trying to get at, and I think in relation to one of your earlier questions, that when you see global South elites and elites in the West now too, who say that we stand for the little people. So there's Donald Trump goes to Detroit and stands in front of a non-union car factory and says he stands for workers, when he did his entire administration was trashing workers' rights in every respect and deregulating companies. Anti-elitism is is actually the dominant belief around the world today. So the management of that anti-elitism is the principal problem of the political establishments, and some parts of them are a kind of break away from the dominant norm and openly espouse what was before. You couldn't say those words. You couldn't say Africa's a shithole. Washington, D.C. is this or that, or Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers and so on, right? And Norwegian people are more preferred than others. And now in India, for example, a secular state and so on and so forth. But now you have openly communal speeches in parliament, and the leadership enables and allows and facilitates and appeases those. So anti-elitism is actually, so even the Modi government is saying the westernized cosmopolitan elite of the Congress party, etc., etc. That form of thinking exists in Britain, across Western Europe, in North America, in Latin America as well. It is the dominant because people, ordinary people in those societies, actually are not getting very much in terms of employment, standards of living, and the kind of stability which in which they want to actually live. They're at the receiving end of some of the most negative elements of globalization, and when people are in those positions, they resist. So I think there's, I mean, you can see examples of resistance everywhere. Massive strike waves across the Western countries, in Britain as well. You have doctors, junior doctors, and consultants on strike at the same time. Never happened before. Every branch of the workforce. The United States had more strikes in the last 5, 7 years than it has in the previous 40 years, and so on. So that you have all kinds of discontent, and that's the real organic crisis, if you like. It is decades long, it is deep, it's comprehensive, it's in every part of the system, and it has created, and this is what Gramsci warned about. He says, in these situations, the elite aren't just sitting there waiting for themselves to collapse and for those people, the radicals, to march in. They're trying to create new realities. Some of them are liberal, and some of them extreme right wing and more coercive or some are mixtures of the two. So, in that context, I guess I was just sort of trying to give myself a little bit of hope after being so grim and depressing, and which I believe to be the case. When you look at resistance is the dominant position, and but the leadership for that is the big problem.
I think those are all my questions for today. Thank you again, Dr. Parmar, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much for your questions. They're really thought provoking and very interesting and necessary questions. And I think debating those questions and giving voice to more kind of radical voices, outside voices, which give perspectives, which challenge kind of mainstream ways, I think, is one of the key things that we need to try to open up more and more spaces for, because we hear the dominant voices free of charge. They're slapped onto a bus stop, on the big billboards, on the electrical digital displays. When you click Google something, the first 20 websites come from the usual suspects, and the kind of reasoned voices of dissent need more and more space. So thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast, and for the EPW for kindly publishing my article as well.
It was our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
also want to thank all of our listeners for joining us. You can find the links to this paper in the episode show notes, and you can find more episodes of Research Radio as well as our other podcasts at epw.in/podcasts. And to experience all that EPW has to offer, head over to epw.in today and subscribe. This is Johan saying bye bye, and see you next time on Research Radio.